The father of America, the first president, the man on the dollar bill. But who was George Washington, really? Not the marble statue we see in monuments, but the flesh-and-blood human being who built a nation from nothing. In the next hour, we're going to explore every aspect of Washington's life. His childhood struggles, his military failures and triumphs, his presidency, and the decisions that shaped America forever. This isn't the sanitized version from your high school textbook. This is the complete story of a man who was far more complex, flawed, and human than history often portrays. So, settle in, because we're about to dive deep into 67 years of the most consequential life in American history. Early life and formation. February 22nd, 1732, Westmoreland County, Virginia. George Washington is born into a world of tobacco plantations, slavery, and British colonial rule. His father, Augustine, is a moderately successful planter, not wealthy by Virginia standards, but comfortable. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, is from a respectable family, but she's also demanding, controlling, and never quite satisfied with her eldest son's achievements. Here's something most people don't know. Washington wasn't born to be great. He was the third son, which in colonial Virginia meant he wouldn't inherit the main family estate. His older half-brothers from his father's first marriage would get the prime properties. This early disadvantage lit a fire of ambition in young George that would burn his entire life. When George is 11, his father dies suddenly. This tragedy reshapes his entire future. His older half-brother, Lawrence, becomes his mentor and father figure. Lawrence had married into the powerful Fairfax family and lived at Mount Vernon. George spends much of his youth there, absorbing lessons about leadership, social connections, and military service. Washington's education was practical, not classical. While wealthy planters' sons went to England for university, George learned surveying, mathematics, and basic Latin at local schools. But his real education came from watching and learning from Lawrence and the Fairfax family. At 16, Washington becomes a professional surveyor. This isn't just a job, it's his ticket to understanding the Virginia frontier. He spends months in the wilderness, mapping land, dealing with settlers and Native Americans, learning territory that would later prove crucial in his military career. In 1751, George accompanies the tubercular Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the tropical climate will cure his brother's illness. It doesn't work. Lawrence dies the following year. But this trip to Barbados is Washington's only time outside North America. He also contracts smallpox there, which leaves him scarred but immune to the disease that would kill thousands during the Revolutionary War. Lawrence's death in 1752 changes everything. George inherits Mount Vernon and, more importantly, Lawrence's position as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia. At 20, George Washington becomes Major Washington. The Ohio Valley. Britain and France are positioning for war over this vast territory, and Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia needs someone to deliver an ultimatum to French forces. He chooses the 21-year-old Major Washington. This 900-mile journey through wilderness in winter makes Washington's reputation. He travels with a small party, including Christopher Gist, a frontiersman who saves Washington's life multiple times. Washington keeps a detailed journal documenting everything. When published throughout the colonies, it makes him famous before his 22nd birthday. But fame comes with consequences. In 1754, Washington leads a force to secure the Ohio Valley. At Jumonville Glen, his forces attack a French party, killing 10 men, including the leader. The French claim Jumonville was a diplomat on a peaceful mission. Washington insists they were spies. This skirmish becomes the opening shot of the French and Indian War. Washington retreats to a hastily built fort he names Fort Necessity. It's a terrible position, in a valley, surrounded by hills with poor drainage. The French and their Native American allies surround him. After a day-long battle in the rain, Washington is forced to surrender. He signs a document in French which he cannot read, admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. This humiliation haunts him for years, but teaches him crucial lessons about preparation, positioning, and understanding your enemies. Military career and marriage. General Edward Braddock arrives from Britain with 2 regiments of regular army troops. Washington volunteers as his aide de camp, eager to learn European military tactics. Braddock is everything Washington is not. Rigid, by the book, dismissive of colonial advice. Washington tries to warn him that European tactics won't work against French and Native American fighting styles. Braddock ignores him. At the Battle of the Monongahela, Braddock's army marches in perfect formation through the Pennsylvania wilderness. French and Native American forces attack from concealed positions. It's a massacre. Braddock is killed. 2/3 of his army is destroyed. Washington has 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat, but emerges unscathed. Native Americans later say the Great Spirit protected him. Washington draws a different lesson. European tactics must be adapted to American conditions. At 23, Washington becomes colonel and commander of the Virginia Regiment. For 3 years, he defends 400 miles of frontier with inadequate men, supplies, and support from colonial politicians. He learns logistics, diplomacy with Native American tribes, and the frustrating art of working with legislators who promise everything and deliver little. Washington meets Martha Dandridge Custis at a dinner party. She's the wealthiest widow in Virginia, 26 years old, with 2 young children, and an estate worth over £100,000. Washington is 27, a war hero, but still a relatively minor planter. Their courtship is brief and strategic. They marry on January 6, 1759. Martha brings to the marriage 17,000 acres and 300 slaves. Suddenly, Washington jumps from minor planter to major landowner. But Martha also brings something more valuable: 2 children from her first marriage, 4-year-old Jackie and 2-year-old Patsy. Washington never has biological children, which becomes a source of deep personal pain. But he pours his paternal instincts into Martha's children. He's particularly devoted to Patsy, who suffers from epilepsy. When she dies in 1773 at 17, Washington is devastated. For 15 years, Washington focuses on becoming the perfect Virginia gentleman planter. He expands Mount Vernon from 2,000 to 8,000 acres. He experiments with crops, moving away from tobacco toward wheat and other grains. He establishes a fishery, a distillery, and various manufacturing operations. Mount Vernon becomes a nearly self-sufficient operation employing over 300 people, most of them enslaved. This is where Washington's relationship with slavery becomes complex and troubling. He owns over 300 slaves by the 1770s. He's not a particularly cruel master by the standards of his time, but he's still a master. He struggles with the contradiction between his growing belief in human liberty and his economic dependence on slave labor. Washington also serves in the Virginia House of Burgesses from 1758 to 1775. He's not a great speaker. He rarely gives speeches and is often awkward in debate. But he's an excellent committee member, someone who reads every document, understands complex issues, and builds consensus behind the scenes.
Path to Revolution. The Stamp Act of 1765 changes everything. For the first time, Britain is directly taxing the American colonies without their consent. Washington initially responds cautiously. He's not yet ready for open rebellion, but he begins thinking seriously about American rights versus British authority. Washington joins the Virginia Non-Importation Association, agreeing to boycott British goods until the Townshend Acts are repealed. This isn't just political posturing for Washington, it's economic necessity. He's trying to reduce his debts to British merchants. The Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the Intolerable Acts in 1774, each event pushes Washington further toward revolution. But he's still hoping for reconciliation until very late in the process. May 1774. The Virginia House of Burgesses calls for a day of prayer and fasting to protest the closing of Boston Harbor. The royal governor dissolves the assembly. The Burgesses reconvene at the Raleigh Tavern and call for a Continental Congress. Washington is chosen as one of Virginia's 7 delegates. First Continental Congress, Philadelphia, September 1774. Washington arrives wearing his old military uniform, a not-so-subtle reminder of his military experience. He says little in debates, but makes a strong impression on delegates from other colonies. John Adams writes that Washington appears to be the most important figure in that assembly. April 19, 1775. Lexington and Concord. News of the fighting reaches Virginia within days. Washington writes, "Unhappy it is to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast." May 1775. Second Continental Congress. Washington again arrives in military uniform. The Congress faces a crucial decision. Who should command the Continental Army besieging British forces in Boston? John Adams nominates Washington. Washington's selection isn't unanimous, but it's decisive. Why Washington? He has more military experience than most delegates. He's physically impressive, 6'3" tall, athletic, dignified. He's from Virginia, the largest and most powerful colony. He's wealthy enough that no one questions his motivations. On June 15, 1775, Washington accepts command of the Continental Army. He refuses any salary, asking only that Congress pay his expenses. In his acceptance speech, he says, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with."
The Revolutionary War. Washington arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, expecting to find an army. Instead, he finds 14,000 colonial militiamen who come and go as they please, elect their own officers, and have little discipline or organization. He writes, "I found a numerous army of provincials under very little command, discipline, or order." The first task is creating an actual army from this armed mob. Washington establishes strict discipline, standardized uniforms and equipment, and begins training European-style military formations. Many New England soldiers resent this Virginia aristocrat trying to impose order on their democratic militia. The siege of Boston drags on for months. Washington desperately needs artillery to drive out the British fleet. In one of the war's most audacious operations, Henry Knox transports captured cannon from Fort Ticonderoga 300 miles through winter wilderness to Boston. In March 1776, Washington positions these guns on Dorchester Heights, making Boston Harbor untenable for British ships. The British evacuate without a fight. This bloodless victory makes Washington a hero, but he knows harder tests are coming. The British are moving south to New York, where they plan to cut off New England from the other colonies. August 1776. The Battle of Long Island. British General William Howe lands 32,000 professional soldiers on Staten Island.
Washington has perhaps 19,000 men, many of them inexperienced militiamen. The British attack across multiple fronts. It's a disaster for the Americans. But then Washington makes one of the most brilliant decisions of his career. Under cover of fog and darkness, he evacuates his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. Every man, every horse, every piece of equipment makes it across. The British wake up to find empty trenches. The retreat continues through Manhattan, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. Washington's army melts away as enlistments expire and soldiers simply go home. By December 1776, he has fewer than 3,000 men left. Thomas Paine writes, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington knows he needs a victory to save the revolution. On Christmas night, 1776, he leads his remaining forces across the ice-filled Delaware River and attacks Hessian forces at Trenton. It's a complete surprise. The Americans capture nearly 900 prisoners and much-needed supplies, while suffering only 4 casualties. A week later, Washington strikes again at Princeton. These victories, though small, electrify American morale and convince France that the Americans might actually win. 1777 brings new challenges. British strategy divides into 3 columns. Washington can't stop all 3, so he focuses on protecting Philadelphia while hoping Northern forces can handle the invasion from Canada.
At Brandywine and Germantown, Washington attacks British forces moving toward Philadelphia. Both battles are defeats, but they show the Continental Army can now fight European-style battles and retreat in good order. Still, the British capture Philadelphia, forcing Congress to flee. But then comes news that changes everything. Burgoyne's army, invading from Canada, has been surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga. This stunning victory convinces France to enter the war as America's ally. The winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge tests Washington's leadership more than any battle. His army is starving, freezing, and melting away through desertion. Soldiers leave bloody footprints in the snow. Congress provides little support. Many officers and politicians begin questioning Washington's leadership. But Washington holds the army together through sheer force of will. He shares the hardships of the soldiers, visiting the sick, ensuring they get what little food and clothing is available. Baron von Schwieben arrives and begins training the army in European military tactics. By spring, the Continental Army emerges from Valley Forge as a professional fighting force. The British, under Cornwallis, establish a base at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington sees an opportunity. With the French fleet controlling the sea and French troops reinforcing his army, Washington races south for what he hopes will be the war's decisive battle. The siege of Yorktown lasts 3 weeks. On October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders his entire army. The war is effectively over. Presidency and founding the nation. December 23rd, 1783, Annapolis, Maryland. In a simple ceremony that shocks the world, George Washington resigns his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and returns to Mount Vernon as a private citizen. King George III reportedly says that if Washington does this, he will be the greatest man in the world. This resignation establishes the crucial principle of civilian control over the military. Washington could have been king, emperor, dictator. Instead, he chooses to be a citizen. Washington hopes to spend his remaining years as a gentleman farmer, but the new nation is falling apart. The Articles of Confederation create a weak central government that can't pay its debts, regulate trade, or maintain order.
The Constitutional Convention. Washington is unanimously elected President of the Convention, lending his prestige to the proceedings. He says little during debates, but his presence legitimizes the entire enterprise. The Constitution that emerges creates a strong executive, in large part because everyone assumes Washington will be the first president. The Electoral College unanimously elects Washington as the first president of the United States. John Adams becomes vice president. Washington's inauguration in New York City establishes many precedents: the oath of office, the inaugural address, the peaceful transfer of power. As president, Washington faces the impossible task of creating a government from scratch. Every decision sets a precedent. How should people address the president? How should cabinet meetings work? What's the relationship between federal and state governments? His cabinet reflects the political divisions already emerging. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, wants a strong federal government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, prefers limited federal power, agricultural interests, and friendship with France. Hamilton's financial plan dominates the early presidency. The federal government assumes all state debts from the Revolutionary War, establishes a national bank, and creates new taxes to fund the government. These policies are controversial, but they establish American credit. Foreign policy proves even more challenging. War breaks out between Britain and France in 1793. Hamilton wants to support Britain. Jefferson supports France. Washington chooses neutrality, issuing a proclamation that America will remain neutral in European conflicts. This angers both sides, but keeps America out of a war it can't afford. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 tests federal authority. Farmers in western Pennsylvania rebel against Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey. Washington personally leads federal forces to suppress the rebellion, demonstrating that the new government will enforce its laws. By his second term, partisan divisions are hardening into political parties. Hamilton leads the Federalists, Jefferson the Democratic Republicans. He deplores this development, fearing that party loyalty will override national unity. Washington's farewell address in 1796 summarizes his political philosophy. He warns against permanent foreign alliances, excessive party spirit, and sectional divisions. He urges Americans to preserve the Union above all else. Final years and legacy. March 4th, 1797. Washington attends John Adams' inauguration, then returns to Mount Vernon as a private citizen once again. He's established another crucial precedent: the voluntary transfer of presidential power. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington tries to be the gentleman farmer he's always wanted to be. He experiments with new crops, redesigns the mansion and grounds, and entertains a constant stream of visitors. Mount Vernon becomes a pilgrimage site. But retirement brings new challenges. Mount Vernon is expensive to maintain and increasingly unprofitable. Washington owns over 300 slaves, but he's growing uncomfortable with slavery. In his will, he provides for the freeing of all his slaves after Martha's death, the only major founder to free all his slaves. December 12th, 1799. Washington spends the day riding around Mount Vernon in cold, wet weather. He develops a throat infection that quickly worsens. Contemporary medicine can do nothing. On December 14th, surrounded by Martha, his physicians, and his slaves, George Washington dies at age 67. His death shocks the nation and the world. Napoleon orders 10 days of mourning in France. The British fleet flies flags at half-staff. Americans hold funeral processions in every major city. But what's Washington's real legacy? He didn't write the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't a brilliant military tactician or political theorist. What made him indispensable was his character, his willingness to accept responsibility, his ability to hold people together in impossible circumstances, and his understanding that how you use power is more important than getting power. Washington established the presidency as an office of service, not privilege. He showed that American democracy could work because Americans could choose leaders who would give up power voluntarily. He proved that a nation could be founded on principles rather than blood and soil. George Washington wasn't perfect,
He owned slaves, he had a fierce temper, and he made plenty of mistakes. But he was exactly what America needed at the moment it needed it most. He took 13 quarreling colonies and helped forge them into a nation. That's why we still study Washington 225 years after his death. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was human, flawed, struggling, learning from his mistakes, but always trying to do what was right for the country he helped create. George Washington proved that the American experiment could work. Everything that came after, all the growth, all the struggles, all the progress, began with his willingness to take on an impossible job and somehow make it work. That's the real measure of the man, and that's why his story still matters today.